It was supposed to be a show of force, a way to use America's economic muscle to bring a defiant neighbor in line. Instead, it's quickly spiraling into a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe for the United States. Following a series of escalating White House tariffs, a stunning and unprecedented shift in Canadian public sentiment has kicked off a massive travel freeze, and the U.S. is feeling the chill. The fallout has been swift and brutal. Major airlines are in a panic, staring at a 30% collapse in demand for flights across the border and scrambling to cancel thousands of routes to American cities. From Florida's sunny beaches to New York's bustling streets, the American tourism industry is facing an economic winter it never saw coming. This isn't just another political spat or a headline you can scroll past. It's shaping up to be a full-blown economic war, and the first, most shocking casualties are American businesses and jobs. The White House wanted to teach Canada a lesson, but it seems the lesson is now being taught in the other direction, with devastating consequences for the American economy. To get how we reached this breaking point, you have to rewind to March of 2025. That's when the Trump administration, in its second term, decided to rewrite the rules of trade with its closest allies. The weapon of choice? A series of sweeping, punishing tariffs, starting with a blanket 25% tariff on most Canadian and Mexican imports. A slightly lower, but still painful, 10% tariff was applied to the critical oil and energy sector, a move seemingly calculated to squeeze the lifeblood of the Canadian economy. But that was just the opening shot. In the months that followed, the pressure only intensified. Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum were reportedly jacked up dramatically. The long-running dispute over softwood lumber exploded, with reports of punitive duties reaching staggering new heights. This wasn't a negotiation. It felt like an economic bludgeoning. The unspoken message from the White House seemed to be that Canada's economic sovereignty was conditional, subject to the whims of its larger neighbor. This aggressive stance was amplified by a constant barrage of inflammatory rhetoric. President Trump began to publicly and repeatedly refer to Canada as America's 51st state, a dismissive jab at a proud, sovereign nation. The strategy seemed clear: create enough economic pain and political humiliation that Ottawa would have no choice but to cave to Washington's demands, especially with the critical 2026 review of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, on the horizon. The administration believed it was operating from a position of unshakable strength. The assumption was that Canada, with its economy so deeply tied to the U.S., would just take the hit. They assumed that history, a shared border, and deep economic links meant Canada would complain, but ultimately comply. It was a monumental miscalculation, a failure to read the room. The White House lit a fuse, thinking it was attached to a firecracker. They were about to find out it was a powder keg. This wasn't seen as just a policy dispute in Canada. It was seen as a declaration of hostility, and it would provoke a response far more powerful than anyone in Washington ever imagined. The tariff shockwave of 2025 didn't have the effect Washington intended. Instead of causing panic in Canada, it did the opposite. It forged a powerful sense of national unity and defiant resolve. The constant economic pressure and the belittling 51st state rhetoric backfired, spectacularly awakening a dormant Canadian nationalism. A buy-Canadian sentiment exploded across the country. What started on social media quickly grew into a powerful consumer-led movement. Canadians began consciously choosing domestic products, supporting local businesses, and rerouting supply chains away from American suppliers where they could. It became an act of patriotism to check the label and, if it said "Made in the USA," to put it back on the shelf. This wasn't a government directive. It was a choice made in millions of households. This surge of economic patriotism created a political tidal wave. The existing government struggled to handle the crisis as the public mood soured on compromise. People wanted a leader who would stand up to the pressure from Washington. This political firestorm led to a dramatic shift in power, with the rise of a new political force, Mark Carney. While not officially Prime Minister, Carney, the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, emerged as a figure tailor-made for the moment. He wasn't a typical politician. He was a global financial heavyweight who understands the levers of the international economy better than almost anyone. His rise was fueled directly by the public's desire for a strong response. And a strong response came quickly. The new government immediately announced a $1.3 billion investment in border infrastructure, aimed at facilitating trade with countries other than the U.S. Then, Ottawa fired back with its own volley of retaliatory tariffs, slapping a 25% tariff on used $20 billion worth of American goods, pointedly targeting products from key political districts in the United States. The message was clear. If you're going to inflict economic pain, we can return the favor. With Carney's rise, Canada was no longer just reacting. It was pushing back, setting the stage for an even bigger escalation. The Buy Canadian movement was about more than just groceries. As the trade war heated up and the rhetoric from Washington grew more hostile, the sentiment evolved. It took on a new, more potent form, a massive, spontaneous shift away from U.S. travel. The feeling spread like wildfire through Canadian communities. Why spend our vacation dollars in a country that treats us with such contempt? Hashtags like our Don't Fly American and Buy Canadian became rallying cries. This was the ultimate expression of consumer power. No government told Canadians where to travel. It was a collective decision by millions of people who felt their national pride was on the line. They decided, en masse, to vote with their wallets, or more accurately, with their passports. The numbers are staggering. In just a few months, demand for travel from Canada to the U.S. plummeted by an almost unbelievable 30%. Data from Statistics Canada painted a stark picture. In the last reported month, the number of return trips by Canadians from the U.S. fell by a shocking 24.3% compared to the previous year. That's 1.6 million fewer trips, 1.6 million fewer hotel stays, restaurant meals, and shopping sprees in America. This wasn't a statistical blip. It was a structural collapse in a massive travel market. For decades, American tourist spots have relied on a predictable flood of Canadian visitors. Now, that flood has slowed to a trickle. Canadians, especially the highly sought-after snowbirds who escape winter for months at a time, started looking elsewhere. Destinations in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Europe saw a surge in interest from Canadian travelers determined to take their money anywhere but the U.S. Airlines, which are hypersensitive to these shifts, were the first to feel the full force of this. They couldn't ignore the thousands of empty seats on flights heading south. Analytics firm Cirium reported that flight capacity between the two countries had already fallen by 10% in the last month alone, a direct result of the cratering demand. The market had spoken, and airlines faced a brutal choice: fly near empty planes and lose millions, or make drastic cuts. The decision was inevitable. The airline industry's response to this new reality has been nothing short of dramatic. The flight schedules for summer 2026 look like a full-scale retreat from the American market. The most shocking move came from Air Transat. For the entire summer of 2026, the airline has canceled every single one of its flights to the United States. Let that sink in. A major international airline has completely wiped its busiest season schedule clean of its largest neighboring market. Just last summer, Air Transat operated 9 routes to U.S. destinations, mostly in Florida. Come June 2026, the last of those planes will depart, and then nothing. For the countless businesses in Florida that depend on those passengers, this is an economic earthquake. WestJet, one of Canada's 2 largest carriers, followed with its own brutal cuts, suspending 16 routes to the U.S. and pulling out of 10 American cities entirely. These weren't minor routes. They included major travel arteries like Vancouver to Boston and Toronto to Los Angeles. All told, WestJet is slashing its annual cross-border capacity by a staggering 10%, signaling a major pivot away from the U.S. But perhaps the most strategic move came from the nation's flag carrier, Air Canada. While also cutting U.S. flights, Air Canada began an aggressive reallocation of its planes and resources, pouring them into other markets, especially Mexico. The airline announced it's boosting capacity to Mexico by a massive 18%, adding 1,700 more seats every single day. The flight from Montreal to Cancun, for example, is up 57% to 11 flights per week. Air Canada is sending a clear signal. The Canadian tourism dollars that once went to Florida are now being redirected to Cancun. This isn't a temporary change, it's a structural realignment. While some smaller carriers are adding a few flights, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the tidal wave of cancellations. The airlines, in their pragmatic way, are confirming the devastating success of this travel shift. The empty gates at American airports are the physical proof of a multi-billion-dollar disaster manufactured in Washington, D.C. This situation is changing by the day. If you want to understand the real-world consequences of this trade war, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. We also want to hear from you. What do you think of this travel shift? Is it a justified response by everyday Canadians, or an overreaction that will end up hurting both sides? Let us know in the comments. Those empty airline seats represent a tidal wave of lost revenue crashing down on the American economy. The decision by millions of Canadians to spend their money elsewhere is now causing acute pain in tourism-dependent communities across the U.S. Florida is ground zero. The Sunshine State's entire tourism model was built on the reliable migration of Canadian snowbirds. The cancellation of all of Air Transat's summer flights, plus massive cuts from others, has torn a catastrophic hole in this model. Hotel owners in Orlando and condo landlords in Fort Lauderdale are all reporting a dramatic drop in bookings. But the pain isn't just in Florida. Hubs like New York, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas are also feeling the chill. A 30% drop in one of your largest international markets isn't something you just brush off. It means fewer Broadway tickets sold, fewer shopping sprees on Rodeo Drive, and more empty tables on the Vegas Strip. When you remove millions of high-spending tourists from the equation, the economic damage easily runs into the billions, and the fallout extends far beyond tourism. Canada's retaliatory tariffs on U.S. $20 billion of American goods are now inflicting targeted pain on farmers and manufacturers in the very states that form the president's political base. At the same time, President Trump's own tariffs are boomeranging. Punishing duties on Canadian steel and aluminum have dramatically increased costs for American automakers. Sky-high duties on Canadian lumber have sent the price of new homes soaring. There are even warnings of more direct disruptions. Threats to block vital infrastructure, like the Gordie Howe International Bridge, could bring auto industry supply chains to a grinding halt. The Eurasia Group has warned that severe disruption in Ontario's auto sector will inevitably cause chaos for U.S. suppliers and plants. In an attempt to punish Canada, the White House has inadvertently laid siege to its own economy. This is no longer just about trade policy. It has become a deeply personal, high-stakes feud between two leaders, President Donald Trump and the face of Canada's new defiance, Mark Carney. It's a clash of the bulldozer against the strategist, and this personal animosity is now pushing both nations closer to the brink. Faced with the undeniable economic damage, President Trump hasn't backed down. Instead, he has reportedly doubled down with threats of fresh escalations. He seems to see Canada's defiance not as a predictable response, but as a personal insult. There are reports he has threatened to impose a crippling 100% blanket tariff on all Canadian imports if Ottawa moves forward with new trade deals with China. The reported threats have moved beyond tariffs. The White House has allegedly floated the idea of grounding all Canadian aircraft from U.S. airspace, a move that would sever North America in two. Furthermore, the threat to physically block the Detroit-Ontario Bridge has been put on the table. These are not the actions of a leader looking for a way out. They are the gambits of a leader who can't stand being outmaneuvered. On the other side is Mark Carney. The Trump administration may have expected an easily intimidated politician. They got something else entirely. As a former head of two central banks, Carney is unintimidated by bluster and is reportedly a tough and unyielding negotiator. He has publicly stated his desire for a settlement but has made it clear that Canada will not be bullied. Instead, he continues a strategy of targeted retaliation and strategic pivots away from the U.S. This personal dynamic is now the single biggest obstacle to a resolution. President Trump's disdain for Canada's tough style and Carney's refusal to be cowed have created a dangerous stalemate. The upcoming 2026 USMCA review, once a routine check-in, now looms as a potential flashpoint where the entire continental trading relationship could be torn apart. It's a battle of egos, with the economic well-being of over 400 million people hanging in the balance. As the canceled flights pile up, the U.S.-Canada relationship stands at a precipice. Here are 3 potential ways this could unfold. Scenario 1. Total economic war. This is the darkest path. President Trump makes good on his most extreme threats, imposing a 100% blanket tariff, grounding aircraft, and blockading the border. Canada, with its back against the wall, would be forced to retaliate with every tool it has, possibly by using the 2026 USMCA review to withdraw from the pact entirely. The result would be a catastrophic collapse of supply chains and a deep, painful recession in both nations. Scenario 2. A bitter de-escalation. In this future, the economic pain in key U.S. states becomes too much to ignore. Quiet, back-channel negotiations begin. To save face, both sides agree to a staggered rollback of tariffs. Trump declares victory, while Canada claims it defended its sovereignty. Airlines might slowly add back a few U.S. routes, but the trust that took decades to build would be gone. The relationship would be permanently scarred. Scenario 3. The Great Canadian Pivot. Perhaps the most likely scenario. Canada decides the relationship with the U.S. is just too unstable. It aggressively accelerates its pivot away from the American market, forging new trade alliances with Europe and the Asia-Pacific. The Buy Canadian movement becomes a permanent part of the culture, and the travel shift becomes structural. Airlines solidify Mexico and other destinations as the new default for Canadian vacationers. In this scenario, the U.S. doesn't just lose a few $billion. It loses its #1 tourism and trade partner for a generation, left to grapple with the long-term consequences of its own actions. The story of the 2026 Canadian travel shift is a stark lesson in cause and effect. An aggressive tariff strategy, meant to project strength, has backfired in spectacular fashion. It ignited a powerful consumer movement, crippled a vital sector of the American economy, and inflicted a deep, self-inflicted wound that could take decades to heal. The empty airport terminals in Florida and the rerouted planes flying to Mexico aren't just data points. They're the tangible results of a profound political miscalculation. The White House thought it was picking a fight with a timid neighbor it could dominate. It found out it was punching a hornet's nest. And now, as American airports fall silent and billions in tourism dollars evaporate, the real question isn't whether Canada can survive this conflict. It's whether the United States can afford the consequences of a war it started and a war it now seems to be losing. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next update.